Daniel's eyes opened to a dim, flickering red light. The air smelled strange, heavy with a sweet and sharp scent that made his throat itch. Metal groaned above him, and somewhere in the distance, something dripped steadily, echoing in the silence. He pushed himself up, feeling the rough floor of the wrecked corridor beneath his palms. His head ached, and his ears rang from the crash. He glanced around. The walls were bent and cracked, torn apart as if giant claws had ripped through the ship's metal. His small survival bag lay a few feet away, half buried under debris. When he reached for it, he heard a soft, deliberate sound, a branch breaking. It was close. Daniel froze. The sound wasn't random. It was too heavy for an insect, too slow for wind. He held his breath, straining to listen. Another crunch of broken wood came from just beyond the gaping hole in the corridor wall, where the jungle crept in. The vines there moved slightly, as though something was pushing them aside. His instincts screamed at him to hide, but before he could move, a voice spoke from the darkness. "You smell. Irresistible." The words were soft, almost like a whisper, yet they cut through the air as if spoken right next to his ear. A cold shiver crawled down his spine. He turned slowly. She was standing in the shadowed opening, tall and lean, her pale green skin glistening faintly in the red light. Her hair, black and wild, framed a face that was both beautiful and wrong. Her eyes were too large, their pupils narrow slits like a predator's. And when she smiled, he saw teeth that were sharper than any human's. Daniel's pulse quickened. She tilted her head, sniffing the air with a slow, deliberate motion, her gaze locked on him like he was prey. "What are you doing here?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Her eyes didn't blink. "Surviving." She stepped into the corridor, the light catching the faint shimmer of moisture on her skin. Her bare feet made almost no sound against the metal floor, but every movement was slow and careful, as if she were stalking him. "This ship crashed 2 days ago," she continued, her voice low and calm. "Most of your kind didn't make it." She paused, inhaling again. "And now, the smell is even stronger." Daniel's throat felt dry. He took a step back, gripping the strap of his survival bag tightly. She matched his movement, stepping forward at the same pace, never breaking eye contact. "You're," he hesitated, choosing his words, "one of the crew?" Her mouth twitched into a smile. "Not exactly." The corridor seemed smaller now, the air heavier. He glanced toward the exit, but she moved slightly to block it. Her presence filled the space, and it wasn't just her size, it was the way she watched him, every muscle in her body ready. "What do you want?" Daniel asked quietly. She leaned her head closer, stopping just far enough away that he could feel her breath on his cheek. "I told you," she whispered, "you smell irresistible." He could see the fine lines along her jaw, the subtle twitch of her fingers as if she was holding herself back. There was hunger in her eyes, raw and dangerous. His mind raced. Running meant turning his back to her. Talking felt like holding a thin piece of glass between himself and a storm. He tried a different approach. "If you kill me, you'll be alone here. You might need me." Her smile faded into a thoughtful expression. She studied him for a moment, as if weighing the truth of his words. Then, without warning, she stepped past him, her shoulder brushing his arm. The contact sent a jolt through him, not just because of her closeness, but because he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. She stopped a few steps ahead, glancing back over her shoulder. "You're not wrong," she said softly, "but don't think that makes you safe." Daniel swallowed hard. Her tone wasn't a promise, it was a warning. She moved toward the flickering light at the far end of the corridor, her shadow stretching across the broken walls. Every few steps, she glanced back at him, her eyes narrowing slightly, her nostrils flaring as though testing the air again. Daniel stayed where he was for a moment, gripping the strap of his bag so tightly his knuckles turned white. The jungle outside whispered and shifted, but he couldn't tell if it was the wind or something else waiting. When she reached the exit, she paused and looked back once more. The dim light caught her teeth as she smiled faintly. "Come," she said, almost gently, "or something else will eat you before I do." Her words were calm, but Daniel heard the truth in them. This place wasn't safe, not from her and not from whatever else was out there. With no real choice, he followed. The smell of the alien jungle poured in through the broken wall, thick with life and decay. Every step felt like walking deeper into a predator's den. And somewhere behind the rustle of leaves and the hum of unseen creatures, her earlier whisper echoed in his mind, making his skin prickle. "You smell irresistible." Daniel kept a few steps behind her, watching the way she moved. Her steps were slow but precise, like every sound she made was under her control. Even the vines hanging across the corridor seemed to slide away from her, as if they knew she was dangerous. The ship's hull opened up completely ahead, revealing the alien jungle. Outside, the light was dim, filtered through a ceiling of enormous leaves. The air was warm and thick, and the ground was soft with layers of strange moss. Far in the distance, something large moved between the trees, its silhouette gone in seconds. Daniel's skin tightened at the sight. The alien girl glanced back at him, her sharp eyes scanning him from head to toe. "You're afraid," she said quietly. "I think that's reasonable," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. She smirked, revealing the faint glint of her teeth. "Fear makes the scent stronger." Daniel's throat felt tight. She was still talking about the smell, his smell. It was like she couldn't stop reminding him that he was food in her eyes. He didn't know whether she was taunting him or just being honest. They walked through the wreckage, parts of the ship twisted around tree trunks like scraps of foil. Strange insect calls echoed from above, and every so often, Daniel thought he saw movement in the canopy. She moved without hesitation, pushing through thorny plants that seemed to shy away from touching her skin. After a while, she stopped and turned toward him. "You won't last an hour here without me." "Then why don't you just kill me now and get it over with?" Daniel asked, trying to sound braver than he felt. Her eyes narrowed, and she stepped closer until they were only inches apart. "Because I am curious, she said, her voice like a purr. "Humans don't belong here, and yet here you are, still breathing. That interests me." Daniel didn't move. He knew if he stepped back, she would just follow. "If you really want me to survive," he said, "then we help each other. I know machines. I can fix things. If there's an escape pod or a transmitter, I can make it work." She tilted her head, considering. Her nostrils flared again as she breathed in his scent. "And what do I get if I help you?" "I'll find you food," Daniel said. "Something, not human." She smiled faintly, though it was impossible to tell if it was from amusement or hunger. "You think you can bargain with a predator?" "I think you haven't eaten me yet," he replied. For a moment, neither spoke. The jungle hummed around them, 100 different creatures calling from hidden places. Then, slowly, she stepped back. "Fine," she said. "We find your machine. But if I get too hungry, I won't stop." Daniel nodded, though the weight of her words sank deep in his chest. They moved on, leaving the wreck behind and stepping deeper into the jungle. Towering plants with wide, fleshy leaves swayed in the warm air. Some dripped thick, amber-colored liquid that hissed when it touched the ground. The smell was sharp, almost metallic, and Daniel avoided stepping near it. She moved like she had walked this place her whole life. Every so often, she would pause, tilting her head as if listening to something he couldn't hear. Once, she grabbed his arm suddenly and pulled him behind a massive root. A shadow passed overhead, a winged creature with a body the size of a truck. Its wings were like stretched glass, and each flap sent a gust of warm, foul-smelling air over them. When it was gone, she let him go. "You make too much noise," she said, almost like a teacher scolding a student. "I'm not exactly built for stealth," Daniel muttered. "You will learn," she replied. They reached what looked like the remains of another section of the ship. Most of it was crushed under fallen trees, but Daniel spotted a control console buried halfway in dirt. He rushed to it, brushing away the moss and soil. "This could work," he said, checking the wiring. "If I can get this powered up, I can locate the escape pod's signal." She crouched beside him, watching his hands closely. "You move quickly with your fingers," she said softly. The way she said it made him uncomfortable, like she was thinking of more than just his work. He kept his focus on the wires. "I work better when no one's trying to eat me." Her laugh was low and short. "Then hurry." Daniel managed to get the screen to flicker to life for a moment before it went black again. "I need a power cell," he said. She stood, scanning the jungle. "Then we hunt for one." The way she said hunt made him uneasy. He realized that to her, the word meant more than just finding an object. It meant stalking, chasing, killing. They set off again, deeper into the shadows of the jungle. Each step felt heavier. the air thicker. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that every rustle of leaves was something watching them. She seemed completely at ease, but every so often she would glance at him with a look he couldn't read. Part curiosity, part hunger. When the sky above began to darken, she stopped and turned to him. "Night is worse," she said simply. "We'll need shelter." Daniel followed her to the hollow base of a massive tree, its roots arching over them like the ribs of a giant beast. She sat down across from him, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "Rest," she said. "I'll listen for danger." Daniel tried to relax, but her gaze never left him. Every time he shifted, her head moved slightly, tracking him. In the quiet, with only the distant calls of alien creatures around them, Daniel realized the truth. He was as much her prey as he was her companion. And somewhere in her calm, watchful stare, he saw the silent question that made his blood run cold. How long could she resist? Daniel woke to the sound of something breathing close to him. It was slow, steady, and too deep to be his own. He opened his eyes and saw her, sitting no more than a meter away, her glowing eyes fixed on him. She didn't move, but her nostrils flared slightly, as if she was tasting the air. "How long have you been watching me?" he asked quietly. "Since you slept," she replied. Her voice was calm, almost soft, but it didn't comfort him. Daniel sat up, rubbing his eyes. "You didn't sleep?" "I don't need much. Besides," she leaned forward just enough for him to see the sharp glint of her teeth. "I was making sure nothing else got to you first." Daniel couldn't tell if she meant other predators or herself. He pulled his survival bag closer and started checking his gear. "We need that power cell. The faster we find it, the faster we get out of here." Her head tilted slightly. "Out of here? You think the jungle will let you go so easily?" "I think we have to try," he said, forcing himself to meet her eyes. "Unless you want to stay here forever." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood and motioned for him to follow. "Come. I know where we might find one." They moved through the dense undergrowth, the alien plants brushing against their arms and legs. Every so often, Daniel caught her glancing back at him, her gaze intense, as if she was studying more than just his movements. "Why help me?" he asked after a while. "If you're really that hungry, wouldn't it be easier to just end it now?" Her steps slowed, and she didn't look at him when she answered. "You're interesting, and I want to see how long you can survive. Maybe I want to see if you can surprise me." Daniel didn't like the sound of that. It felt like she was treating him like some kind of game. They reached another wrecked section of the ship, half buried under twisted vines. A dark hole led inside, and Daniel could see faint blinking lights from within. "This was a cargo bay," she said. "The machines you want might be here." Daniel crouched and squeezed inside, the smell of burned metal and mold hitting him instantly. He pulled out a small flashlight and scanned the walls. Broken crates and scattered equipment lay everywhere. He spotted a damaged service drone with a compartment on its side. "This could have one," he said, moving toward it. As he worked on opening the panel, she stood by the entrance, scanning the jungle beyond. Her stillness made him uneasy. It wasn't just that she was guarding the door, it was the way she occasionally turned her head slightly toward him, like she couldn't help but check if he was still there. The panel came loose with a snap, and inside was exactly what he needed, a small, intact power cell. "Got it," he said, holding it up. Before he could put it in his bag, a loud clicking sound echoed from outside. She spun toward the noise instantly, her body lowering into a hunter's stance. "They followed us," she whispered. Daniel didn't have time to ask who. The clicking grew louder, joined by the sound of something large moving through the foliage. Then he saw them. Tall, insect-like creatures with gleaming black shells and curved claws. Their eyes reflected the dim light, unblinking. She moved before Daniel could react, launching herself at the first one with terrifying speed. Her claws tore through its shell, spraying dark fluid across the ground. The second one lunged at her, but she twisted away and slammed it into the wreckage with bone-cracking force. Daniel backed into the corner, clutching the power cell. One of the creatures turned toward him, its mandibles snapping. He grabbed a metal rod from the floor and swung it hard, knocking the creature sideways. She finished the last one with a sharp crack of its neck. Then she turned toward him, her chest rising and falling quickly. Her eyes locked on him, not on his face, but on the shallow cut across his arm where the creature's claw had grazed him. Blood was trickling down his skin. Her expression shifted instantly. The muscles in her jaw tightened, and she stepped toward him slowly, like she had during their first meeting. Her eyes darkened, her nostrils flaring. Daniel's grip on the metal rod tightened. "Don't," he said firmly. She froze a few steps away, breathing heavily. Her claws flexed at her sides. For a long moment, it looked like she was fighting herself. Then she turned abruptly and walked toward the exit. "Let's go," she said sharply. Daniel followed, his heart pounding. Outside, the jungle was quieter, but he could still feel the tension radiating from her. She didn't look at him as they walked back toward the control console, but he could see her hands trembling slightly. When they reached the wreckage, Daniel set the power cell into place. The console lit up, a faint hum filling the air. "We're in business," he said. She stood behind him, close enough that he could feel her presence, but she said nothing. The silence stretched until finally she spoke. "You're lucky I made a promise," she said quietly. Daniel didn't ask what would have happened if she hadn't. He already knew. The console's hum was steady, but Daniel could feel her gaze on him as he worked. Every time he shifted, he sensed her head move slightly, tracking his movements like a predator studying prey. He kept his eyes on the glowing display, forcing himself to ignore the tension in the air. The screen flickered, showing a map of the wreckage spread across the jungle. The signal for the escape pod pulsed faintly on the far edge of the display. "There," he said, pointing. "If we get to that, we can leave this place." She stepped closer, her shadow falling over him. "That is deep inside the red canopy," she said slowly. "Few go there, fewer return." Daniel glanced up at her. "And what about you?" Her lips curved slightly. "I have returned, but it's not without risk." Before he could reply, a low growl echoed from the jungle outside. It was deep and long, vibrating through the ground. She straightened, her eyes narrowing toward the sound. "We have to move now," she said sharply. "Predators are on the hunt." Daniel grabbed his survival bag and slung it over his shoulder. They stepped out of the wreck and into the jungle. The air felt different, warmer, heavier, and filled with a strange humming sound, as though the trees themselves were alive and watching. She moved quickly, weaving through massive roots and ducking under low-hanging vines. Daniel followed as best he could, his boots slipping on damp moss. Strange flowers turned their heads toward him as he passed, releasing puffs of glittering spores into the air. The sweet scent made his head spin. "Don't breathe too deeply," she warned without looking back. "Some plants here feed through the lungs." Daniel tightened the cloth mask around his mouth and nose, his eyes scanning for movement. Every few seconds, he caught a glimpse of something darting between the trees, too fast to fully see, but always just far enough away to be unsettling. After an hour, they reached a clearing. The ground was covered with deep gouges, and the remains of some large animal lay torn apart in the center. Bones glistened in the dim light, stripped completely clean. She crouched beside the remains, sniffing the air. "Not fresh," she murmured, "but close enough to know they hunt here often." Daniel's stomach twisted. "So, we're walking through a killing ground?" "Yes," she said simply, standing again. "But it's the fastest way." They crossed the clearing quickly, but halfway through, Daniel felt it, a faint vibration in the ground, like footsteps too large to be human. She froze instantly, her head tilting as she listened. From the shadows between the trees, something massive stepped forward. Its body was covered in black scales that shimmered faintly, and its jaws split open in 4 sections, each lined with rows of teeth. Daniel's breath caught. "What is that?" She bared her own teeth in return. "Competition." The creature roared, the sound shaking the leaves overhead. It charged, and she moved to meet it, her claws flashing. She leapt onto its head, slashing at its eyes while it thrashed violently. Daniel stumbled back, searching desperately for anything to help. He spotted a sharp piece of metal jutting from a fallen panel and grabbed it, running toward the fight. She landed beside him, breathing hard. "Aim for the throat," she said quickly before launching herself at the beast again. Daniel darted forward, driving the metal shard deep into the creature's neck, just as she tore at the exposed flesh. The roar turned into a gurgle, and the monster collapsed, its heavy body shaking the ground. As the echoes faded, Daniel turned to her, panting. "You're welcome." She looked at him for a long moment, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Then she leaned closer, her voice low. "You fight well for prey." Daniel wasn't sure if it was a compliment or another reminder of what he was to her. They didn't stay in the clearing. The smell of blood was already spreading, and she warned it would draw others. They moved deeper into the jungle until the ground sloped downward into a narrow gorge. Here, the air was cooler, but the walls on either side pressed close, the space too tight to move quickly. Daniel hated it immediately. It felt like a trap. Halfway through, they heard scraping sounds above them. Daniel looked up to see shadowy shapes crawling along the rock walls, their movements insect-like. "They're hunting us," she said, her voice calm but urgent. "Don't stop moving." Daniel kept pace with her, his eyes darting upward as the shapes followed. One dropped down ahead of them, blocking the path. Its legs were long and jointed, its eyes glowing faintly green. Before Daniel could react, she was already there, her claws sinking into its body. More dropped down behind them, forcing Daniel to swing his makeshift weapon again. The confined space turned the fight into chaos. Screeches, the smell of alien blood, and the sharp clang of metal against stone. When the last of them lay still, Daniel leaned against the wall, catching his breath. His arms ached, and his shirt was torn, revealing another shallow cut on his shoulder. She stepped close, her eyes locking on the wound. For a moment, her breathing quickened, and Daniel saw her jaw tighten. "You're bleeding again," she murmured, almost to herself. Daniel shifted away slightly. "I'll be fine." She said nothing, but her eyes stayed on him for a moment longer before she turned and started walking again. The gorge opened into another dense section of jungle. In the distance, Daniel could see the faint glimmer of metal, perhaps the escape pod. But he also noticed the way her pace had quickened, her movements sharper. Something was changing in her, and he didn't know if they would reach the pod before it was too late. Daniel could see the faint metallic shape ahead, half hidden under thick vines and wide alien leaves. His heart lifted slightly. It had to be the escape pod. If the systems inside were intact, it could be their way out. But as they pushed forward, he noticed something else. Her breathing had changed. It was faster, deeper, like every inhale was a struggle to control herself. She didn't speak, but her eyes kept darting to him, lingering just a moment too long on the cuts along his arm and shoulder. Every time she glanced away, her claws flexed and unflexed as if they were itching to move. The jungle around them was unnaturally quiet now. No bird-like calls, no rustling in the canopy, just the faint crunch of their steps and the sound of her breathing. Daniel tried to focus on the pod, but the silence pressed in on him. When they reached it, the pod's hatch was half buried under roots. Daniel dropped his bag and began cutting the vines with a broken piece of paneling. The air here was warm and stale, carrying a faint metallic tang. He worked quickly, but after a few minutes, he realized she was standing very still behind him. When he turned, she was watching him with an expression that made his chest tighten, hungry, conflicted, and almost pained. "You need to. Keep working," she said, but her voice was lower, rougher. Daniel swallowed hard. "I am." Her gaze didn't leave him. She stepped closer, the movement slow, deliberate. "Your scent is stronger now." Daniel gripped the paneling tighter. "We had a deal. I help you get out. You don't?" "I know," she cut in sharply, but she didn't stop walking toward him. "Do you think it's easy? Do you think I can just turn it off?" He backed up until his shoulders pressed against the pod's hull. She was close now, close enough that he could see the fine lines in her eyes, the way her pupils had narrowed to sharp slits. "Tell me to stop," she whispered. Daniel's heart hammered. "Stop." For a second, he thought she might actually listen, but then she leaned closer, her nose almost touching his neck. She inhaled slowly, and he felt the warmth of her breath against his skin. Her claws pressed lightly into the metal beside his head. He didn't dare move. Every instinct told him she was seconds away from breaking her promise. Then, suddenly, she turned her head away with a sharp exhale and stepped back. Her claws scraped the pod's surface as if she needed something to anchor herself. "Go inside," she said tightly. Daniel didn't argue. He pulled the last of the vines free and forced the hatch open. The stale air inside rushed out, and he climbed in. She followed, crouching to fit through the opening. The pod's interior was dusty, but mostly intact. The control panel was dark, and the seats were covered in a fine layer of fungal growth. Daniel began checking the systems, brushing away debris. "Power cell," he said, holding out his hand. She passed it to him silently. Her eyes didn't seem to leave him as he worked, and he could feel her gaze on the side of his face. When the cell clicked into place, the controls lit up dimly. Daniel tapped through the screens, checking fuel and systems. "We're lucky," he said. "This might actually—" A loud, wet clicking echoed from outside. It was followed by a second, then a third. The sound was too heavy, too deliberate to be insects. Her head snapped toward the hatch. "We're not alone." Daniel grabbed his makeshift weapon, but she held up a hand. "Stay here. If they get past me, then you fight." Before he could reply, she slipped out of the pod. The sounds outside grew louder: thuds, snarls, and the tearing of foliage. Daniel sat frozen, listening to inhuman screeches mixed with the sharp sounds of her attacks. Then there was silence. When she stepped back inside, her skin was streaked with dark alien blood. Her breathing was heavier, and her eyes locked on him immediately. "You're hurt," she said, noticing a fresh scrape on his hand. "It's nothing," Daniel replied, but she moved toward him quickly, closing the space between them. She crouched in front of him, her claws resting on the floor. "You keep bleeding in little ways," she murmured. "Do you not understand what that does to me?" Daniel stayed still, unsure what would happen if he tried to move past her. "I understand enough," he said quietly. Her jaw clenched, and for a long moment she just stared at him. Then she stood abruptly, turning her back. "We leave at first light," she said. He watched her settle against the pod's wall, her posture tense. She didn't close her eyes, didn't rest, just sat there, listening to the jungle outside, every muscle in her body coiled like a spring. Daniel lay back in his seat, but he knew he wouldn't sleep. The escape pod was their way out, but trapped inside with her, he wasn't sure which was the greater danger, the jungle outside or the hunger sitting a few feet away. The first light of the alien dawn seeped through the cracks in the pod's hatch, painting the walls in pale gold. Daniel sat up, stiff from the hard seat. She was already standing, her silhouette framed by the open door. The cool morning mist clung to her skin, making it glisten faintly. She didn't look at him when she spoke. "We move now. The red canopy isn't far, but the longer we stay, the more things will follow our scent." Daniel nodded, powering down the pod's systems and securing the power cell in his pack. He stepped outside, feeling the damp moss under his boots. The jungle in the morning was eerily quiet, the usual insect calls replaced by a low, distant rumble that he couldn't place. She led the way, moving with the same precise steps as before, but Daniel noticed her shoulders were tense, her head tilting slightly every few moments, as if listening for something. The air grew warmer as they walked, the trees taller, their trunks twisting into shapes that seemed almost deliberate. By mid-morning, the light from above was almost gone, replaced by a reddish glow filtering through the thick canopy overhead. The air smelled stronger here, rich, heavy, and mixed with something sharp that made Daniel's skin prickle. "This is it," she said quietly, "the red canopy." Daniel looked around. The leaves above them were crimson, almost translucent, and they pulsed faintly, as if alive. Beneath them, the ground was littered with bones, some alien, some disturbingly human. "Stay close," she warned. "The things here hunt in silence." They moved between the massive trunks, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of decaying leaves. Every so often, Daniel thought he saw shapes moving in the red light above, but whenever he looked up, there was nothing. After some time, they reached the base of a huge tree whose roots curled high above the ground, forming a hollow beneath. Nestled inside was a metallic crate, half buried in dirt and tangled roots. "That's it," Daniel said, moving forward, but she caught his arm. "Not so fast." The warning came just as something shifted in the shadows under the roots. Two pale eyes opened, unblinking, followed by the slow, sinuous movement of a scaled body. The creature was long, its limbs thin and sharp, its skin blending perfectly with the roots. It slid forward, silent, until it was almost upon them. Then it struck. She moved instantly, shoving Daniel back and slashing at the creature's head. It screeched, the sound shrill and piercing, before darting away into the canopy. Daniel's ears rang from the noise, but he didn't waste time. He ran to the crate and began clearing the dirt. Inside was a small container marked with alien script. He pried it open and found what they'd been searching for, an emergency beacon. If he could repair it and power it, they wouldn't need to risk the long journey back to the pod. He turned to show her, but stopped. She was standing completely still, her claws dripping with the creature's blood. Her eyes were fixed on him, not the beacon. "You're bleeding again," she said, her voice low. Daniel glanced at his arm. The creature's strike had grazed him, leaving a shallow cut. "It's nothing. Nothing to you," she interrupted. "But to me." She stepped closer, her gaze never leaving the blood. Daniel tensed, clutching the beacon tighter. "Don't." Her breathing grew heavier. She reached up, almost touching his arm, then stopped with her claws trembling in the air. "I can hear your heart," she murmured. "I can feel the heat of it from here." Daniel's mind raced. "We have what we came for. Let's just go." She closed her eyes for a moment, then exhaled sharply and stepped back. "Fine." They began the journey back, but the air between them felt different now. Every time Daniel glanced her way, she was already looking at him, her expression unreadable. Halfway through the red canopy, they heard the rumble again, closer this time. The ground shook under their feet, and the crimson leaves above began to shiver. "It's hunting us," she said flatly. A massive shape dropped from the canopy, landing between them and the path. Its body was like a fusion of muscle and armor, and its mouth opened in 4 directions, lined with serrated teeth. Daniel backed away slowly, but she stepped forward, her claws bared. "Run when I tell you." The creature lunged, and she met it head-on, slashing at its eyes and driving her claws into its chest. Daniel hesitated, but when she shouted, "Now!" he obeyed, sprinting through the undergrowth. Behind him, the sounds of battle echoed. Roars, the crack of bone, the hiss of alien blood on the forest floor. Then there was silence. He stopped, breathing hard, unsure if she had won or if the creature had. A moment later, she emerged from the shadows, covered in blood, her own and the creature's. She walked toward him slowly, her eyes locked on him. "You didn't run far enough," she said, her voice quieter now. Daniel gripped the beacon. "You're hurt." Her smile was faint, strange. "So are you." There was no one else around, no other danger but her. The jungle seemed to hold its breath. And Daniel realized, with a cold twist in his gut, that the next danger he faced might not come from the red canopy at all. Daniel took a step back, but the thick roots behind him stopped his retreat. She stood only a few feet away, her chest rising and falling quickly, her eyes fixed on him like she was no longer fighting the hunger, just deciding how to act on it. Her claws flexed at her sides, the tips leaving tiny grooves in the damp earth. "We're alone now," she said softly, almost like it was a fact she needed him to understand. Daniel's grip on the emergency beacon tightened. "We can still make it to the pod. Just a few more hours and... Hours?" She gave a short, humorless laugh. "Do you have any idea what hours mean to me right now?" He swallowed hard, watching her every movement. "You've held back this long. You can do it a little longer." Her expression softened for the briefest moment, but then she stepped closer, the glow of her eyes sharp in the dim red light of the canopy. "You think it's that simple? You think I haven't dreamed of the taste?" Daniel forced himself to stand still, even though every muscle in his body wanted to run. "If you kill me, you lose your only chance of leaving this place." Her gaze flicked to the beacon, then back to his face. For a long, tense moment, she said nothing. Then she whispered, "Maybe I don't care anymore." The sound of distant movement broke the standoff. Heavy steps, deliberate, growing louder. She turned her head sharply toward the noise, her body tense and ready. "They're coming," she said. "If you want to live, follow me." Daniel hesitated only a second before running after her. They moved fast through the dense undergrowth, the red light above flickering as something massive moved through the trees behind them. The ground shook with each step it took. "This way," she called, darting into a narrow passage between 2 massive trunks. Daniel squeezed through, branches clawing at his clothes. The space opened into a shallow cave hidden behind thick vines. She pulled him inside, her claws slicing through some of the vines to block the entrance again. "Quiet," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The footsteps outside grew louder, then stopped right in front of the cave. Daniel held his breath. Through the gaps in the vines, he saw a hulking shadow, its head turning slowly as it sniffed the air. For a horrible moment, he thought it had found them. But then it moved on, the sound of its heavy steps fading into the distance. Daniel exhaled shakily. That was too close. She didn't answer. Instead, she looked at him again, her expression unreadable. You smell stronger now, she murmured. The fear. It makes it worse. Daniel's pulse quickened. We don't have time for this, he said firmly. We need to go before it comes back. She stepped closer again, but this time her voice was lower, almost like she was talking to herself. I could take just enough not to kill you. Daniel tensed. And then what? I bleed out before we reach the pod? Her eyes narrowed slightly. You think I can't control myself? I think you're fighting something you don't want to win, he replied. Her jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Instead, she pushed past him, slicing through the vines at the back of the cave. We'll circle around. The pod is this way. They emerged into a lighter section of jungle, the red canopy giving way to green again. The air felt fresher, easier to breathe. Daniel's hope grew, but he kept glancing at her. She was still tense, still quiet, her gaze occasionally flicking toward him in a way that made his skin crawl. By late afternoon, the outline of the escape pod came into view through the trees. Daniel almost smiled, but stopped when he saw her slow down. This is it, she said softly, almost as if the words were heavy in her mouth. They stepped into the clearing. The pod sat exactly as they'd left it, hatch still open. Daniel moved toward it quickly, but before he could climb in, she caught his arm. Daniel, she said, and for the first time, his name sounded different on her tongue. Softer, almost sad. When we leave, the hunger will still be there. I don't know how long I can keep it from you. He looked at her, searching for the right words. Then we'll figure something out. Together. Her eyes searched his face for a long moment. Then, without warning, she pulled him close, not in an attack, but in a sudden, fierce embrace. He felt her breath against his neck, warm and shuddering, before she pushed him toward the pod. Go, she said firmly. Daniel climbed inside, securing the beacon to the controls. She followed, crouching into the cramped space. The hatch sealed shut, and the hum of the systems filled the silence. As the pod lifted off, the jungle shrank beneath them. Daniel glanced at her. She was watching him again, but there was no immediate hunger in her gaze this time. Only something quieter, more complicated. She leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. You still smell irresistible. Daniel didn't know if it was a warning or something else entirely. But as the stars came into view beyond the glass, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't done with her, and she wasn't done with him.